I recently read that 91.9% of marketers use social media to promote companies or themselves.
Wow, that's crazy.
Massive.
91.9%. That's a very specific stat.
I did my research.
So, building a brand on social media, what do you think has changed over the past kind of year or so?
Well, I think when social media originally started, it was a social platform for people to engage with friends, family, people they might not be in close contact with. But of course, naturally, people always want to try and monetize things. So it has become, especially over recent years, a massive marketing platform, not just for companies, but for people with their own personal brands. And it's basically blown up to be, I feel like we're introducing the world to social media. It's blown up to be a massive marketing tool. I recently read that 91.9% of marketers use social media to promote companies or themselves.
Wow, that's crazy.
Massive.
91.9%. That's a very specific stat.
I did my research.
I think one of the big things about building a brand on social media now compared to kind of when social media started is people are a lot more clued up. And I'm not just talking about marketers, I'm not just talking about business owners, but the people that you're marketing to.
Yeah.
And I think when things or trends that happened maybe 5 years ago, now the time difference between trends is so quick. Like you have to be so reactive now compared to, things might be weeks, now it's days and sometimes hours. Things like Twitter, where you miss out on a conversation and it's gone.
Yeah.
And you're never going to come back from that. I think also big brands have realised that a lot more now as well, and they've been a lot more playful with their social media and building their own brand.
It definitely, when it first started, used to be very corporate of here's our brand message, here's what we do, here's our service, take it or leave it. And I think, like you said about the audience, has evolved and trends. People, especially since COVID as well, people now are looking for much more safety and higher purposes and values that they can align with. They want to feel like they're part of a community and part of a cult. And I think, like you said, a lot of companies now are realising that and are using social media not just to promote their services, but to actually engage with audiences and try and find like a common ground that maybe they wouldn't have had a few years ago.
I think one of the things I've seen recently, think back maybe like 3-4 years ago, you had supermarket chains and things that their Twitter or their social media would be about complaints or about people just complaining up to the supermarket. Whereas you probably say they're quite corporate brands in some way. Another corporate brand I found was Ryanair.
Yeah.
And I think what they've done now with TikTok, and TikTok's an interesting platform because people just go, oh, it's just for fashion or dancers. But big brands like Ryanair are now taking hold of this just really creatively and just taking the mick out of like the lack of legroom or people like the cheap flights. And you just think that's like unheard of if you think about that 5 years ago.
Yeah, but then I think people that go to Ryanair know exactly what they're getting when they go. So and especially if you think of their demographic, they are going to be young people who are up for a laugh, who will go to Ryanair regardless of the bad service, the small legroom, because they just pay for what they're getting and they don't mind really. So I think, and especially with the Colin the Caterpillar, a lot more companies are jumping on the bandwagon of talking to each other. And when Colin the Caterpillar went to court, didn't it, for like copyright
I don't think he
infringements.
specifically went to court.
Well, no. I thought he did. That all blew up, and all of the rip-off Colin Caterpillars were all getting involved, and you wouldn't have had that a few years ago. It would have been unheard of.
Yeah, I think the one thing I took away from that was the big brands really jumped on that trend as quickly as possible, and they didn't really think about the repercussions. There was probably a meeting room somewhere where people were like, what if this happens this way or this way? But it was just about having the fun of it. And the brands that jumped in were getting the most media attention because they were the early adopters. And I think with social now and the way that it's changed is instead of lengthy review processes and we need to put this content out and schedule things, it's much more, we need to do this now or we lose it. And the opportunity cost is greater now than it is for the reputational damage, for sure.
Yeah, and I think it's about being confident enough to take those risks because, like you said, if you miss out, there's no way that you can go back in time and get on it. If you're late to a trend, if anything, that can probably do more damage of trying to join the party late than it would if you just... Sometimes it's just best to bow out and be silent and not try and jump on too late to it. But I do think that social is massive for branding. Would you say that social has the same value in terms of marketing? Do you think that it's better for branding, or do you think they need to work together? What's your view on that?
I think with branding and social, it's really interesting because you can build your own brand through social, as we say. So, if you take for like personas, or if you take the channels, take back quickly to the Ryanair example, is they've really niched on the type or the demographic that they're going for in TikTok. Mm-hmm. So they've built their brand, or that sub-brand, to that target audience. And it doesn't really affect their overall brand as Ryanair, because people, think about branding very differently. And I think that's quite interesting about brands and how they've transitioned, because, you would have one corporate brand, like say, a supermarket chain, which very much across all platforms would be, this is our brand, and that's it. Yeah. Whereas now, even some of these bigger chains and bigger companies are, as I say, just reviewing each one individually and going, we could do something creative with this. So I think there's probably that difference between.
But do you think,
branding.
For Ryanair example, do you think that they thought this is going to be a really good marketing strategy or a marketing opportunity? Or do you think they thought this is a good chance for us to play with our brand? Like, which chicken or the egg, which came first?
I think that's where your question around like marketing versus brand, especially on social,
It's tough.
Yeah, how do you make that work? And what is it? Does chicken or egg? I think ultimately brand is what you kind of define as thinking about, or how you think about, say, Ryanair. Mm-hmm. And marketing definitely is the tactic. So in this case anyway, TikTok and social media is using their brand and their kind of influence across those channels to make their brand come alive. And ultimately, that's what you're trying to do. I think that's where those two things work in harmony. Yeah,
I think you can put out your marketing, but if the higher purpose of the brand or the joke or whatever it is you're trying to align with your audience on isn't there, it will fall flat. But you could have an amazing brand, but without any marketing to get out there to the people you're trying to talk to, you have to have both. Mm. And I think now more than ever, social media is just the best place to really let your brand personality and a more informal side of your brand shine through. And ultimately, you will find your niche and people who are going to be on the same wavelength that really will engage with you.
Yeah. I think also with marketing, aside from brand, your marketing is your continual effort to keep your brand alive. Mm. So making sure that you are at the forefront of pushing the creativity in what you're doing. So whether that is through TikTok or whether that is through SEO or your website, it's how do you push your marketing activity to inform your brand, which I think is quite an interesting one as well.
And I think marketing also offers a lot of value to brand in terms of measuring your key metrics and making sure that it's performing and doing well. Mm-hmm. We can have an amazing brand, but how can we tell if it's doing well? You'd need some sort of marketing strategy there to make sure that it's performing as you want it to.
So it's an interesting one though, because I think with digital in particular, everyone's stuck in this rhythm of we must see ROI. We must see what the return is on our marketing efforts. And I think brand is tangible or not, because you can measure it through brand sentiment or questions or surveys or omnibus surveys as to how you feel about your brand or how someone feels about your brand. But can you really put like a value or a saying on it? Because everyone interprets it differently, right?
Yeah, I would personally say it's engagement, and it's difficult. But I think because brand is so emotive, it's how people feel when they see your brand and how they engage with the marketing materials. How can you measure that? How can you measure the emotion people feel? I guess you can measure it by how much they actually engage with it and what people's response is. So it would probably be less hard metrics, but more what people are saying in the comments and how much people are sharing it. And when they share it on their own profiles, what are they saying there? When it's almost behind closed doors, away from your brand, what are they saying about your brand?
Yeah, I think reviews and sort of those, trust signals, as you'd call them, are so important now as well, because you could go onto like a fashion brand's website, social media channel, and if you're looking at a review of something, or if you're looking at buying a product, and then they've just posted that product, and there's like 20 going, I hate this product, it's rubbish, don't buy it, and you're like, oh, actually, that's probably gonna change that quite a lot. So that's probably again where brand comes into marketing, and your vehicle, your tool that you're using versus the brand you're trying to put out is so important.
Do you know how many people are on social media?
I've
got a stat. 3.6 billion people are on social media, or they were in 2020.
Really?
That's such a big audience for people to capitalize on. And of course, companies and corporate entities are going to be the first to jump on that. But it goes more than that now. That's a massive audience of people that all have opinions. They all have massive decisions. They all have an influence. Yeah. And branding now has gone further than just corporate identity. We've also now gone on to personal brands, which is massive. And people having that influence. And again, this whole conversation started with people trying to monetize social media. And it's not just the big companies that started doing it. People as individuals started doing it and becoming influencers and things like that. So I feel like it all trickles down, and now we've got so many influencers trying to build a personal brand, which is crazy. And I feel like there's so much pressure on young people especially to have a niche, have an audience, have a USP. What's your opinion? What's your angle? It's a lot, but it can also be a really good thing if you got the right people, trying to do the right causes. But personal brand has become massive.
Yeah, I mean, this is probably one of my favourite topics to talk about. But I think personal branding in particular, there's a lot of confusion, I think, between personal branding, influencer marketing and affiliate marketing and all of that.
Teach us. What's the difference?
What's the difference? Well, I think starting with personal brand is that it's not a concept that anyone doesn't know. I think it's one of those things that you go, yeah, I probably could guess that. And it is basically the assumption that you are a brand, you are online. So, the brand of B or the brand of Jordan, what do I, how do I present myself online? And I think ultimately you could just change the word brand or personal brand to reputation. Yeah. It's very much the same. I was
just going to say, I know that we've taken it onto like a digital platform now with social media, but if you think about the brand of certain characters, like Indiana Jones, he would have had a personal brand, wouldn't he?
Yeah.
There'll be characteristics that you can see. There'll be people that are aligned with his mission. That I just think everyone technically has a brand. It's just how you position it and how much you want to put that into your social.
Yeah. And I think that's where, so personal branding in particular is such an interesting area because everyone has one, but one of the things to make it your own brand is that you have to be aware of it.
Yeah.
Because if you're not aware of it, you're not putting towards your brand. And I think that's probably the only difference I would say of people just posting online or people just putting stuff out on social because they think they have to. Actually, it's a concerted effort to make something, to put your post out there and to put yourself out there.
So then this goes back to the original. Would you say that everybody has a personal brand on social media? It's just whether or not you're actively marketing yourself?
I think everyone has a persona online.
Right.
Explain. There's a difference. But everyone has a persona. Everyone, you post and you, let's take an example of an Instagram post, right? So you would put something out, you put a photo out and you write a caption. You might even self-censor yourself, but you're putting out what you see as that, which means other people will see it in that way, or you like to hope so. And I think that regard, it's a persona. So you're putting out a version of yourself online. If you're really thinking about it and you're going, okay, I need to think about how Joe Blogs is going to understand from my post and how this is going to work. That's more about the branding of you. And I think when you come to Instagram or Twitter or putting that out there, it's the way you word it, the language you use. Do you sound inspiring, funny, comedic, or however you want to brand that, rather than maybe just your natural self.
But then if you're putting that much level of detail into it and how, especially if you're being consistent with it, which everyone says if you want to build a personal brand or be an influencer, you must be consistent, number one rule. Would you not say that you're then trying to market yourself? That would then be marketing, not just branding.
Yeah, and I think that, again, it goes back to the conversation of, well, what is marketing versus brand? Because ultimately you're trying to build the brand of Jordan or B. How do you create that without then putting yourself out there and using platforms? You don't, do you? Yeah. Same as building a brand, but it just remains on a presentation deck. It's not going anywhere unless you do something with it. And I think that's very similar to personal branding, where you can talk about, setting your own goals or setting your own mission and whatnot. But unless you actively and consistently do that, you're not building a brand.
But branding personally also can relate to your career as well. So obviously you've got a lot of personal brands that can lead to being an influencer, whether it be micro or macro. But even on a smaller scale, a lot of companies, especially if you're in like creative industries or marketing, anything that is digital, the company that you're applying for a job for will look at your personal branding. And a lot of companies now want you to have a strong personal brand so that ultimately increases their engagement and it makes their brand more at the forefront, and it will help generate more leads for them. How much of an influence do you think a company should be able to have on your own personal brand?
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting question, because firstly, for building your own brand, there's a lot of different ways you can go about doing that, as I've mentioned, but you really have to have the effort and the consistency to build it. Now, when you then have that in a work scenario, you've got a lot more things that you should worry about in terms of how you position yourself or what you write. And we've all seen the horror stories of people writing something and their boss has seen it, and then the next day they inevitably are not at that company anymore. And I think that with kind of, you know, branding and marketing and doing that in a work setting, is that you have to be that consistent level, but you've also got to acknowledge the brand that you work for. Because if you don't, those two things then conflict. And if you don't have them in harmony, then you're not going to be a good employee, because you're going to have conflicts in your social media accounts. Because ultimately we come to work because we go to companies we work for that have or share our values. And I think if you're not then showing those values in your personal self as much as you are as your work self, then you're going to have a problem.
Yeah, I would agree. I think that it's good to have a personal brand. Your personal brand, like you say, should naturally align with the company that you work for anyway. But I think that it's important to show who you are as an individual, but also what you do at your company, and having a nice balance between the two. So you could have your opinion-based stuff is your own, but to frequently share the work of your company and things you've been involved with, it helps bring through the more corporate side, but also on more of a personal level, because your company will inevitably be posting on their own social media, but for you to put your own spin on it and say, oh, this was really fun to work on, like I personally enjoyed this aspect of it, it helps people watching all of those accounts see how passionate you are, not just for the company, but for what you actually do. And it helps build a bit more personality and trust, I think, because it shows authenticity. And that's another massive, you know, be authentic on your social, never try and show someone that you're not, and always just be yourself.
I think with the way that people that watch this, marketers that watch this, I guarantee that everyone is asking for more content through their work kind of account. You know, think how you want to put out more blogs or more rich media content, podcasts or video. If you went to your employer and said, I really want to do this, and I think this would be a great concept, and it aligns with what they're trying to do, I guarantee that they're going to say, yeah, let's do it together then. And again, there's another platform for you to push your own personal brand through another company source. And that's where it starts, because then you look at, well, okay, well, I've built my brand and my profile on, say, LinkedIn. Well, actually, those posts are now getting some recognition. This publication wants to then feature on me, or wants to help me write something or write something for their publication. And that's where you start to get that traction. And if you think about it on both scales, well, as long as you're referencing your employer and your name's on there, both of those things are pushing forward, both your brand and your employer's brand, right?
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's nice to have an honest conversation with your employer, especially if you do have a big following or a strong personal brand. It's nice to have an honest conversation, but ultimately, like you said, they are both going to work hand in hand. They are going to help each other. We had an incident a few weeks ago where we had a client that started working with us, and she said, oh my goodness, I've seen you on social media, I've seen your posts. I'm dyslexic and I've posted about that quite a lot on my LinkedIn. And she said, I've seen it, I love your posts that you put out. And that had obviously helped me build a really good relationship with her straight off the bat, not through, selling her my services. It was as me as an individual. She knew my personality and the topics I'd spoken about, being honest with being dyslexic and how that impacts me as a designer. And we could talk about that. So it was such a nice way of just instantly having a connection with someone. And I didn't know that she'd seen that post or anything. But when she came to us as a client from Strategic, I felt so special that she like knew me and we could talk about it, I think. And obviously that's going to do Strategic well because I'm then able to build a really good relationship with her. So I think you never know who's looking at your stuff. And it can be a nice surprise, as it was for me, or it can be a bit of a warning that if I'd have put out something really controversial or something really bad, then the client could have come in the same way, but could have been, I don't like B, I don't know about working with her because she's put out something really dodgy about whatever.
But you'd like to then think that, you know, in terms of our values, probably caring would most relate to that in terms of the content you're putting out. So there's a natural relation there already, isn't there, between you and Strategic and the client seeing both of those and going through that process. I think to flip it slightly though, there are negatives, and I think when you have your own brand, and this probably goes for when you start to have, you know, quite a big following, it's the control aspect of posting, you know, how much do you post about your employer or not post about your employer, or how do you build those brands concurrently? Especially when your interests are different. So your interest is bowling or whatever it may be. That's very different to then what you offer as a service. So I think you have to be really careful about making sure that, you know, you have that honest relationship with your employer and that your employees, if you flip it the other way, feel listened to and respected, that they can post their own thing as well, just as much as you're trying to push them to post about your own business. Yeah,
I think just having that honest conversation with them. But I think when you're building a personal brand, like for me personally, it's finding your niche and finding whatever makes you unique. So being dyslexic and a designer and talking about the struggles you may face, and you'll have people that will want to engage with that because it's a unique topic. If I went on there and tried to just promote myself as a designer, that's when there would be a conflict of interest, because Strategic would then say, well, we'd want you to promote us as design. So I think that's when it would become difficult. But as long as you're talking about yourself and your passion and your interests, that's always going to build everybody up together.
Yeah, and I think that also goes for business owners or credible business people, because not just if you work for you know yourself or it's your own company, you still want to build your own brand separate from your company, right? Because whatever happens, you know, your exit strategy or whatever happens in the future, you want to make sure that your brand sticks with you. You're not the two things merged together.
But then also that your company can stand alone. Because if your company is you as a brand and you try and exit that, that's going to be one of the biggest pillars of the business, isn't it? It's going to be you as a personal brand. So,
and I reckon freelancers have that all the time as well, where they go from freelancing to their own business. But the thing I was going to say is, we spoke at the start around, you know, kind of the recent trends and things. For personal branding in particular, what I find quite interesting is we went through a phase, especially with these big, you know, massive companies, your big four, you know, your Amazons, your Googles of the world, where they were looking at people's social media following before they were making offers for recruitment. Now that's quite interesting in itself, because you then have the best person for the job, but also the highest follower count.
It's down to like public vote.
Is that a stat? Is that a stat? And I think that's going to be a big trend for the next couple of years, where companies, especially those that are very social media or influencer marketing heavy, which we've not particularly covered yet, like Pretty Little Thing, for example, they appointed Molly May as a creative director. Now, I'm sure Molly May's creative directing skills are amazing, but also
at a young age of 21, 22, is she?
Yeah, but also the following that she does have, which is also just as lucrative and valuable to them and to the business. So, you know, she has that influence online, not just as herself, but now she's obviously associated as a creative director. So it just ties that relationship a bit closer together. So I do think we'll probably see more of that, especially with some of these millennial brands or people that target millennial demographic, because the following and the engagement that you see, you know, we talked about Ryanair. Ryanair might do something like that.
The world of Big Brother. Everyone's being watched all the time.
I don't know, their chief pilot will be an influencer, who knows? So it's those kind of things. Yeah. That's a scary thought. Whereas those sorts of things where I think we'll see that more and more. Because I've recently written a couple of strategies specifically about influencer marketing. And it's not to the level of Molly May and that level of status, but also to
But micro-influencers sometimes can be just as more powerful because if you live in a niche area, we live in Suffolk, for example, there are some really key influencers that might only have 5,000 followers, but because the area is so small, their impact is actually massive. So if you are a smaller company, using a micro-influencer would probably do you more benefit than it would if you were using a big influencer that maybe had a lot of followers that weren't directly aligning with what your company values are.
Or niche, if someone is just posting content about Smurfs and, I don't know, the Smurfs brand wants to get in touch, then there you go, you've got your perfect influencer. But the interesting part of that is, with influencer marketing in particular, that's where you can build really cool strategies as well. Because, we've been talking recently about universities and this particular brand wanted to target university students. Well, who best than the people on the ground that are there in those networks, rather than just blasting messages out, the people that they're actually listening to and following and engaging with, that are micro-influencers at the University of X, that's who they're going to listen to, more than maybe an advert they see that it takes longer to kind of pull or push them into different marketing channels.
But I think we've seen the scary influence people have around COVID, which I know is going to be a sensitive subject, but there were so many stats coming off the back of that of how many people, especially young people under the age of 25, believed what they read on social media more than what they would believe on the news and what they would believe from medical professionals. So I think that the power influencers have now is massive, and especially on younger audiences, which if you think about is only going to increase over the next few years, because as they get older, they're not going to get out of those habits. It's then just going to progress and progress and progress, and our whole lives are probably going to be ruled by social media one day, aren't they? Let's be honest, I feel like that's where it's going.
1984 took a weird turn there.
Yeah, sorry.
I think you're right. The way that marketing and influence and the way that we buy products, or if you think about even looking at reviews, we spoke about it earlier, of different companies or different review sites. You go, okay, I'm going to look at a Trustpilot review and I'm going to go, okay, they've got 5 or 4 stars. It seems like a reputable company. I'll work with them. You're just replicating that across to then influencer people. You're saying, I think you're credible because you've got a strong brand, keyword, to buy from. And you see these ads all the time of different things that they sell or push or put through their channels, or relationships they have with companies that might not necessarily be the right to that person, but because they believe in that person and what they do, they'll buy it.
So if someone's watched this and they've thought, oh my goodness, I really want my own personal brand.
Yeah.
What would you say are the best things to build your own personal brand?
That's a good question. I think the key thing about all of it, we spoke a lot around different elements of personal branding, but you have to be authentic. And I know that is probably number one in all personal branding stories ever, of going, you have to be authentic to yourself. But if you have like work profiles, or you've got your own profiles, if those two things are separate, there's probably a problem there at some level, because you're not being your authentic self. And with that, you have that conflict of trying to post and then you're kind of retyping posts because it doesn't quite sound like you want it to sound. And actually it should be natural. It should be who you are online. And I think the other thing to consider with personal branding is, as I mentioned, it's not personal branding unless you measure it or recognize it. And I think you have to make sure that what you're putting out there is resonating, or you're getting it to the right people. So that'd be my tips. What about you?
Mine would be, as you see from a design perspective, to be visually consistent. I think with being authentic, I've seen a lot of influencers that will kind of steal posts from other people, and they'll all look similar, but you're not building your own personal brand. Whatever you're posting out, whether it's opinions or things you're finding, to keep them visually consistent. So when I see something that's, I don't know, got a purple gradient, I think of Rachel, who does salmon fish cakes or whatever her brand is. Whatever her brand is, I see it and I know that that's that person. And I have people like that on Instagram that I follow that I couldn't really tell you their name, but as soon as I see their post, I'm like, oh, I love these posts. But I can never quite remember their name, which probably isn't the best for their personal brand, but their visual identity is so strong and so consistent. Obviously, the second one would be consistency. Find your niche. Always try and go down to what it is you're good at, what it is you're passionate about, so you never run out of topics, you never run out of subjects. Offering value, always try and think of what your audience problem is or what their needs are. If you've had a problem, talk about it and say, well, I had this problem, you guys might too, because we're the same, and then solve that problem for them. And we've spoken about this loads before, but just being sociable on social media.
Why would you?
I don't know. It's crazy. I don't know why, but it has happened that as we've become more immune to social media, that we're engaging with it less. And especially from a corporate perspective, a lot of companies do just post stuff out there as sales message. It's not going to work. People need to feel like they're heard, like they're talked to, like you're on the same level as them. Ryanair, a great example. They know exactly who their audience is. They're playing with them. They're just making a joke of themselves and laughing about it with their audience. It's the best way to create an actual connection with someone.
Yeah. And I think with all of that, it's whatever your niche is, whatever your brand is, whatever it is, you've got to be passionate about it to keep the energy going. If you're not passionate about what you're talking about, you will lose momentum, but you'll also lose the audience because they won't follow you and they won't see that passion through what you're saying. And if you're going to take away anything from this, it has to be authentic. No, I'm joking.
I was waiting for the golden nugget.
The golden nugget. It is that you have to make sure that you are consistent in your posting as well. Not just in what you're posting, but the frequency of posting and just getting it out there. And most people just get, unfortunately, a little bit lazy and they're like, oh, I just didn't give it much thought. I might just share this post, I might do that. People see right through that now. And that's the biggest difference, I think, from the past couple of years is you could have got away with that, 3-4 years ago. You can't now. People see straight through it.
100%. And if you think about the people that are doing it well, they are always at the top of your feed. They've always got that halo around them on Instagram. They've always got an Instagram story. If Instagram is becoming more and more people's CVs, their personal brands, make sure that people can't have a conversation without mentioning you because they've seen you 3 times already today.
Exactly.
Always be at the forefront of their mind.